The contract arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1887, folded inside a cream envelope sealed with dark red wax. It was not addressed to Elspeth. It was addressed to her father, Count Armand Morrow, and it sat on his desk for 3 days before he called her into his study and told her, in the calm voice he used for all difficult things, that her future had been decided. She was 22 years old. She had never fainted in her life, and she did not faint then. She sat in the chair across from her father's desk, her hands folded in her lap, and she listened. She listened the way a person listens to a verdict they already knew was coming. She had grown up watching her 2 older sisters marry for the sake of the family name, and she had always understood, without anyone saying it plainly, that her turn would come. Lord Edouard Vachon was the eldest son of the Vachon family, one of the oldest noble houses in the region of Burgundy. The Vachon estate sat on 200 acres of rolling countryside south of Dijon, and the family's wealth had only grown in the past generation, rooted in vineyards, land, and a long-standing trust with the local banking establishment. Edouard himself was 31 years old, well regarded in the circles that mattered, and considered by most to be a man of stable character and reasonable temperament. Count Morrow explained all of this with the careful precision of a man reading from notes he had already memorized. The Morrow family, he said, had obligations, debts that could no longer be quietly managed. The estate in the Loire Valley had suffered 2 bad harvests and 1 very bad investment. There was a younger son to be educated, a crumbling east wing that needed repair, and a reputation that could only survive so long without the financial backing to support it. The Vachon family wanted an alliance. The Morrow name still carried weight in the right rooms, and there were things that old names could offer that money alone could not buy. A marriage between Edouard Vachon and Elspeth Morrow would benefit both sides. The contract had been drafted with care and reviewed by 2 separate solicitors. Elspeth sat through her father's explanation without interrupting him. When he finished, she asked one question. She asked what Lord Edouard was like. Her father paused for just a moment longer than felt natural. Then he said that Edouard was a serious man, a man of good standing, a man who kept his word. She noticed that he did not say Edouard was kind. She noticed that he did not say Edouard was warm, or easy to speak with, or interesting. She filed these absences away in the same quiet part of her mind where she kept all the things she was not supposed to notice. She said she understood. She signed the contract the following afternoon. Elspeth Morrow was not a dramatic woman. She was precise, and she was observant, and she had a gift for understanding situations with a clarity that other people often found uncomfortable. She had been educated by a governess who believed strongly in mathematics, languages, and the kind of reading that made a woman inconvenient at dinner parties. Elspeth had learned French and English and a working knowledge of German, and she had read more philosophy than most of the men she met socially would ever admit to having read themselves. She was also, by the standards of her time in class, considered somewhat difficult, not because she was unpleasant. She was perfectly pleasant. But she asked questions that did not have easy answers, and she had a habit of listening too carefully, which made certain people feel that she was judging them, which she was, though she tried to be fair about it. She had received 2 previous proposals of marriage before the Vachon contract arrived. She had declined both, gently but firmly, and her reasons were her own. Her father had not pushed her then, because the family's situation had not yet become urgent. By the spring of 1887, the situation had become urgent. She did not resent her father for the contract. She understood that he was a man doing the only thing he knew how to do with a problem he could not solve any other way. What she felt, sitting in his study that afternoon, was not resentment. It was something quieter and harder to name. It was the feeling of a door closing in a room she had not yet had the chance to fully explore. She gave herself one evening to feel it. Then she put it away and began to think practically. She had met Lord Edouard Vachon twice before the contract was drawn. The first time was at a dinner hosted by mutual acquaintances in Paris, 2 winters earlier. She had been seated several places away from him, and they had spoken only briefly, exchanging the kind of polite remarks that people exchange at formal dinners when they have nothing particular to say to each other. He had been well-dressed and attentive, and had laughed at 2 things during the meal, both of which were genuinely amusing, which she had noted as a point in his favor. The second meeting was shorter, a reception following an art exhibition in Lyon 6 months after the dinner. He had remembered her name, which she appreciated, and he had asked about a painting she had been standing in front of when he found her. She had told him what she thought of it, honestly rather than decorously, and he had looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, not disapproval, but something more careful than agreement. Those 2 meetings were the sum of her knowledge of the man she was to marry. She decided that before the wedding she would learn more, not from reputation or from what other people said about him. People's accounts of each other were almost always shaped more by what the speaker needed to believe than by who the subject actually was. She would learn from direct experience. She would visit the Vachon estate, meet the family, and form her own conclusions. Her mother thought this was a sensible idea. Her eldest sister thought it was unnecessary. Her father, who understood Elspeth well enough to know that suggesting she not do something was usually the fastest way to ensure she did it, simply said that he would write to the Vachon family and arrange a visit. The Vachon estate, when Elspeth first saw it in late July of 1887, was exactly what she had expected and nothing she had prepared for. It was large in the way that only very old things are large, not imposing exactly, but simply present in a way that suggested it had been there long before she arrived and would be there long after she left. The stone walls had the color of old bread. The gardens were formal and well kept but not fussy. There was a smell in the air of dry grass and something sweetly herbal that she could not immediately identify and would later learn came from the lavender growing along the south wall. She was received at the front entrance by a housekeeper and shown to her rooms before being brought down to meet the family. Lady Vachon, Edouard's mother, was a small, precise woman with silver hair and the particular kind of composure that takes a lifetime to build. She welcomed Elspeth warmly but with measured warmth, the kind that gives nothing away but offers nothing cold either. Elspeth liked her immediately and, more importantly, respected her. Lord Vachon Sr. was nearly 70, moved slowly, and had the distracted air of a man whose thoughts were almost always somewhere else. He was courteous to Elspeth in the way that people are courteous to furniture they are not certain they will keep. Edouard met her in the front parlor. He stood when she entered, which she noted. He shook her hand with a brief, firm grip and told her the journey must have been long. She said it had not been too bad. He offered her tea. She said yes. They sat across from each other and talked for 40 minutes about things that did not matter. The weather, the condition of the roads, a political matter that both of them touched only lightly before steering away from it. He asked about her reading and she told him, and he nodded in a way that was interested but not particularly engaged. She asked about the estate and he answered competently and without warmth. He was not unfriendly. He was not cold. He was simply very contained, and she could not find the seams in the containment. When the tea was finished, a servant appeared at the doorway and said that Monsieur Matthew had returned from town and wanted to know if he should join them. Edouard's expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled, the way a face settles when it has just made a small decision. He said yes, Matthew should join them. The door opened 3 minutes later. Matthew Vachon was 27 years old, 4 years younger than his brother, and he entered the room the way people enter rooms when they have spent most of their lives being slightly too much for them. He was carrying a stack of books under one arm and a folded paper under the other, and he was still finishing a thought he had apparently been having before he arrived, because his first words were not a greeting but a continuation of something. He said, "The argument in the 3rd chapter is completely wrong, and I think I can prove it, but I need someone to argue back at me or I'll just convince myself I'm right, which always ends badly." Then he looked up and saw Elspeth. There was a pause. He said, "I apologize. I didn't know anyone was here." Edouard, in a tone that was patient the way certain things are patient only because they have had a great deal of practice, introduced them. Matthew Vachon, Elspeth Morrow, future sister-in-law. Matthew set his books down on the nearest table, which was already crowded with other books, and extended his hand. Elspeth shook it. He had ink on 2 of his fingers, which she noticed. He had the same dark coloring as his brother, but where Edouard's face was composed and difficult to read, Matthew's was the opposite. It moved constantly, thinking visible in it the way water is visible in glass. He looked at her with the particular kind of directness that most people reserve for things they find genuinely interesting, and then said, "What was the book?" She said, "I beg your pardon." He nodded toward the volume she had brought down from her rooms and set beside her on the settee. She had almost forgotten it was there. She told him the title. It was a philosophical text, newly translated, that had caused some controversy in academic circles for reasons she found more interesting than the controversy itself. Matthew's face did something that was almost too quick to follow, a brief, involuntary expression of genuine delight, gone almost before it arrived. He said, "That book is either the most important thing published this decade or the most elaborate piece of nonsense I have ever read, and I genuinely cannot decide which." Elspeth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I feel exactly the same way. Which chapter are you on?" What happened next was not what the afternoon had been intended for. Edouard remained in the room for approximately 10 minutes, contributing occasionally, and then excused himself with a quiet and perfectly correct remark about having correspondence to attend to. Neither Elspeth nor Matthew watched him go. They were in the middle of a disagreement about epistemology that had begun as a conversation about the book and had expanded, the way certain conversations do, into something much larger and much more alive. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the wedding, not about the family, not about the estate or the arrangements or the practical facts of what was about to happen to both their lives. They talked about ideas, about the book and what it meant and where it was wrong and where it was genuinely right and what it left out and what it assumed. Matthew argued with real energy and real precision and the particular kind of honesty that does not bother to soften itself because it is too interested in the truth to waste time on cushioning. Elspeth argued back just as directly, and she watched the way his face changed when she made a point he had not considered, not defensive, not diminished, but genuinely pleased, as though finding a flaw in his own thinking was a gift rather than a defeat. When the light in the room changed, and she realized how much time had passed, she felt something pull in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. She excused herself for the evening. Matthew stood, and for just a moment before she left the room he looked at her with an expression she also could not quite name. It was not the careful, contained expression his brother used. It was something else, something more exposed and therefore more difficult to look at directly. She went upstairs. She stood at the window of her room for a while, looking at the lavender along the south wall in the last of the evening light, and she told herself several sensible and reasonable things. She was here to understand the man she was going to marry. She had gathered information about the estate and about the family and about Edouard's habits and manner. The visit had been useful. Tomorrow she would spend more time with Edouard and she would learn more and the picture would become clearer. She told herself all of these things carefully and in order. Then she picked up her book, found the chapter Matthew had mentioned, and read it with a focus she had not been able to manage for the previous 2 weeks. She did not sleep well. In the morning at breakfast, Matthew arrived late, apologized briefly, poured his coffee without sitting down and said, "I thought of a response to the argument you made last night about derived knowledge. You were right about the premise, but I think the conclusion still fails, and I want to explain why before I forget." Edouard, across the table, spread butter on his bread with the same measured attention he applied to everything, and said nothing. Elspeth set down her cup. She told Matthew she was listening. The morning passed, then the afternoon, then another evening. By the end of the 3-day visit, Elspeth had spent a combined total of perhaps 4 hours in Edouard's company, and something closer to 12 in Matthew's. She rode home in the carriage on the 4th morning, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the road outside the window, and she thought about what she had learned. She had learned that Edouard Vachon was a competent and honorable man, controlled, reliable, not unkind, a man who would manage a household well and meet his obligations and never do anything that required apology. She had learned that Matthew Vachon was the most genuinely interesting person she had met in 3 years. She pressed her fingers together tightly in her lap. She told herself with great firmness that interesting was not the point. Interesting was not what a marriage needed to be. Interesting was what a dinner guest was. Marriages were built on compatibility, on shared values, on mutual respect. Marriages were built on the kind of things that lasted through difficulty and time, and the 100 small disappointments that any honest life contained. She was going to marry Edouard, the contract was signed, the families were agreed, the wedding was set for the following spring. She arrived home in the early afternoon, kissed her mother on the cheek, answered her sister's questions about the estate and the family with calm and reasonable detail, and went upstairs to her room. She sat at her desk, she took out a sheet of paper, she began a letter to the Vachon household, thanking Lady Vachon for her hospitality. She wrote the letter carefully, she read it back, She folded it and sealed it. Then she took out another sheet of paper and sat there for a long time, the pen in her hand, not writing anything at all. She was thinking about the way Matthew had looked at her when she had made the argument about derived knowledge. The way he had gone quiet for just a moment, working through it honestly, before coming back with the objection. She was thinking about how rare that was. She put the blank sheet of paper away. She did not write a second letter. She told herself she was not going to write a second letter. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Vachon estate. It was addressed to her. The handwriting on the envelope was not Edouard's. She recognized it anyway, though she had only seen it once, in the margins of the book Matthew had shown her in the library on her last afternoon at the estate. She had not asked to see the book. He had simply thought she would find a particular passage interesting, and he had been right. She held the envelope for a moment before opening it. The letter was 2 pages long. It began with a sentence about a further argument against the position she had taken on the last morning, one he had apparently been developing since she left. It was a very good argument. It was also absolutely not the reason he had written. She could tell because of the way the letter moved. It started with the argument. Then it moved, almost without noticing, into a description of a book he had found in the estate library that she would find either extraordinary or infuriating depending on how she read it. Then it mentioned a conversation he had had with a neighbor about the agricultural situation, and how it had made him think of something she had said about derived knowledge and practical application. Then it said in the last paragraph that he hoped the journey home had been comfortable, and that the estate had felt very quiet since she left. That last sentence. She read it twice. She set the letter down on her desk. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and began to write back. She wrote about the argument first. She demolished it, point by point, and rebuilt it differently, which she knew would delight him. Then she mentioned a book she had returned to since the visit, and why it had struck her differently after their conversations. Then she mentioned something she had seen on the road home that had made her think of the epistemology discussion. She did not mention the last sentence. She did not respond to it directly. But she answered it. She answered it in the length of the letter, in the care of it, in the fact that she wrote 4 pages when 2 would have covered everything she had actually said. She sealed it. She addressed it to the Vachon estate. She sat for a moment before giving it to be posted. Then she gave it to be posted. She was going to marry Edouard in 6 months. She was exchanging letters with his brother. The letters were about books and ideas, and the kind of intellectual conversation that she had not had with anyone in longer than she could honestly remember. She told herself this was not a problem. It was correspondence. It was the kind of correspondence that happened between people who found each other mentally stimulating and had things worth discussing. There was nothing wrong with it. There was nothing in it that needed to be examined too carefully. She went downstairs for dinner. She came back up afterward and found herself wondering, before she slept, what argument he would make against the demolition she had offered. It was not a problem. She was almost certain it was not a problem. The wedding was in 6 months. The contract was signed. Her future was arranged and reasonable and settled. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, she lay very still, and she thought about the last sentence of his letter one more time. The estate had felt very quiet since she left. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. The second letter arrived 9 days after she sent hers. 9 days was not a long time. 9 days was, in fact, a reasonable interval for correspondence between 2 households in separate regions of France, accounting for the post, and for the demands of daily life that made letter writing a task that had to be fit around other things. 9 days was ordinary. Elspeth knew this. She also knew that she had been aware of each of those 9 days, passing in a way she was not usually aware of time passing. She did not go to the post herself. That was not something a woman of her position did. Letters were brought to her on a small silver tray by a housemaid named Cécile, who had been with the family for 11 years and who had the quality of complete discretion that made her invaluable and slightly unnerving. On the 9th morning, Cécile brought the tray, and there was a letter on it, and the handwriting on the envelope was the handwriting Elspeth had been trying very hard not to think about. She thanked Cécile. She waited until the door closed. Then she opened the letter immediately, which she would not have done with any other correspondence, and read it standing at the window with the morning light coming in sideways across the page. He had answered the demolition. It was, she had to admit, a very good answer. He had found the weak point in her third argument, the one she had been least certain about herself, and he had worked it open with a kind of intellectual precision that she found genuinely impressive. He was not showing off, that was the thing she noticed. He was not making the argument to win. He was making it because he actually wanted to find out what was true, and he seemed to understand, instinctively, that the best way to find out what was true was to have someone who disagreed with you think as hard as they could about where you were wrong. She had not met many people who understood that. The letter continued. He described finding a second copy of the controversial text she had been reading, this one with handwritten notes in the margins from a previous owner whose identity he had not been able to determine, but who had, judging by the notes, been either very brilliant or completely confused, possibly both. He said he wished she were there to look at the notes and tell him which. She stood very still for a moment after reading that sentence. Then she read the rest of the letter. It was 3 pages. It ended with a formal closing and his name, Matthew Vachon, written in the same quick, slightly impatient hand as the rest. She read it twice, then she sat down at her desk and began her reply. This became the pattern of the autumn. Letters went one way and came back the other, every 10 days or 2 weeks, and they grew longer as the months passed, the way conversations grow longer between people who keep finding new things worth saying. The books they discussed multiplied. The ideas expanded. He recommended texts she had not read, and she read them and told him where he was wrong about them. She recommended texts in return, and he argued back with the particular energy of someone who had found a genuine opponent and was grateful for it. Her maid Cecile, who brought the letters and took the replies and said nothing about any of it, began to look slightly tired. Elspeth's mother noticed. Mothers always notice. She said nothing directly. She was not a woman who said things directly when an indirect approach was available, but she began to appear in Elspeth's sitting room more frequently in the mornings, often at precisely the time the post arrived. She would settle herself in the small chair by the fire and talk about household matters and family news, and she would watch Elspeth's face with the careful, patient attention of a woman who has been reading her daughter's expressions for 22 years and has become very good at it. Elspeth gave nothing away. She had learned containment from the same source as her mother. It was apparently something that ran in the Morrow family, and she could discuss the household accounts and the condition of the East Wing and the progress of her younger brother's education without allowing any of the other things happening inside her to surface. But her mother had not survived 3 daughters and 30 years of a difficult marriage by being easily deceived. One morning in October, sitting by the fire with her embroidery while Elspeth opened the post, her mother said, very calmly, without looking up from her work, "Is there anything in those letters you would like to discuss?" Elspeth set the opened envelope down on the desk. She turned to look at her mother. Her mother continued to embroider. Elspeth said, "I am corresponding with Matthew Vachon about a philosophical text we were both reading." Her mother said, "Yes." There was a pause. Elspeth said, "It is an interesting text." Her mother said, "I am sure it is." Another pause. The fire shifted. Her mother said, "Elspeth." Elspeth said, "I know." That was the entire conversation. Neither of them said anything further. Her mother finished her embroidery corner and began another. Elspeth read the letter. The letter was about a chapter of the text concerning the difference between knowledge that is inherited and knowledge that is earned through direct experience. Matthew had been thinking about it in relation to something very specific. He did not say what exactly, but the way the argument moved suggested he was thinking about his own life rather than an abstract case. He wrote about what it meant to understand something in theory without having had the chance to test it against reality. He wrote about how some people spend their whole lives with inherited knowledge and mistake it for earned knowledge, and how that particular mistake was one of the most dangerous a person could make, because it was invisible from the inside. She read that passage 3 times. Then she wrote back a reply that was, even by the standards of their correspondence, unusually honest. She wrote about what it felt like to understand something clearly and be unable to act on that understanding. She wrote about the way a correct conclusion could be the most inconvenient thing in the world, and how that inconvenience did not make the conclusion less correct. She wrote about the Stoic philosophers and their idea of accepted necessity, and she wrote about where she thought the Stoics had it right, and where she thought they had failed to account for what it cost a person to accept. She wrote 4 pages without stopping. She went back and read them and felt exposed in a way she rarely allowed herself to feel. She sent them anyway. His reply came in 8 days, which was faster than usual. He wrote, "The Stoics understood necessity better than most, but I think you are right that they underestimated cost. They treated acceptance as a rival. I think it is more like weather, something you navigate rather than something you reach." She sat with that sentence for a long time. They had not mentioned the wedding. Not once in all the letters had either of them named directly what was happening or what was coming. The wedding was in the background of everything they wrote, the way a particular kind of gravity is in the background of everything that moves near it, present, constant, pulling, and never discussed. In November, Matthew wrote about visiting a new exhibition at the museum in Dijon. He described a painting that had stopped him for nearly half an hour. It was not a famous painting, not the sort that people made a point of stopping for. It was a small landscape, rolling hills, a gray sky, a solitary tree in the middle distance leaning slightly away from the prevailing wind. He wrote that what struck him about it was not the technique but the honesty. The painter had not made the tree dramatic, had not made the sky threatening or the hills golden. Had simply looked at a very ordinary piece of world and painted it as it was, including the lane in the tree, the way it had grown at an angle under years of pressure from a wind it could not control and could not leave. He wrote, "I found it very moving, which surprised me. I am not generally moved by landscapes." Elspeth read this and set the letter flat on the desk and pressed her palm over it as though she could hold the words still. She knew what he was saying. She knew it as clearly as she had ever known anything. She also knew that he knew he was saying it, and that he had written it this way through a painting, through a tree growing at an angle, because there was no other way to say it that either of them could afford to say plainly. She wrote back about the painting. She described seeing something similar in a gallery in Paris 4 years earlier, a small painting of a harbor she had nearly walked past. What had stopped her, she wrote, was the water. The painter had understood that still water is rarely actually still. It moves in small ways constantly, and the light on it never looks quite the same twice, and most painters painted it as though it were glass, flat and reflective and predictable. This painter had understood that it was alive. She wrote, "Some things look settled from a distance that are not settled at all when you are close enough to see them clearly." She sealed the letter. She gave it to Cecile. She went back to her desk and sat there for a long time in the quiet afternoon, and she thought about what she was doing. She was corresponding with the man she was not marrying. She was having the most honest and substantive conversations of her adult life with someone she was, by every legal and social and practical measure, not permitted to think about in the way she was thinking about him. The wedding was 4 months away. The contract was signed. The arrangements were made. Nothing about the situation was unusual on the surface. 2 future members of the same family corresponding about intellectual matters, perfectly normal, perfectly respectable. What was not normal was what happened in her chest every time a new letter arrived on the silver tray. What was not normal was the way she reached for arguments in her reading that she knew would interest him specifically. What was not normal was the afternoon she had spent last week, rereading an old letter of his that she had already read 3 times, looking for something she had missed, something she had not yet fully understood. She had understood all of it. That was not why she was rereading it. December came. The letters continued. In December, he wrote about a conversation he had had with an old professor from his years at the university, a man who had retired to a village outside Beaune, and who Matthew visited sometimes when the questions in his head had gotten too large, and he needed someone who would not find them alarming. He wrote about what the professor had said regarding choices, not the dramatic choices, the ones that feel like choices when you are making them, but the quiet ones, the ones you make slowly over time without noticing, each small decision adding to the last until you arrive somewhere and look back and see the path you built and realize it has been yours all along even though you never sat down and chose it. The professor had said, "The decisions that matter most are the ones we make before we know we are making them." Matthew wrote that he had thought about this for several days. He wrote that he thought it was either very wise or very terrifying, and he was not sure those were different things. Elspeth read this on a cold afternoon in December with snow coming down outside the window, and she thought about all the small decisions she had made since July. The decision to answer the first letter, the decision to write 4 pages when 2 would have been enough, the decision to send the letter about the Stoics and cost, and what it meant to accept things that cannot be changed. She thought about the first afternoon in the library at the Vachon estate, when she had told him which chapter she was on, and the way his face had done that quick, involuntary thing that was too fast to be performed. She thought about all the small decisions. She put down his letter, she picked up her pen. She wrote, "I think the professor is right. I think we decide most things before we know we are deciding. And I think the question is not whether we made those decisions, but whether we are honest enough with ourselves to acknowledge them after." She stopped, she read back what she had written. It was the most direct thing she had said since the correspondence began. It was the closest either of them had come to naming what the letters were actually about. She sent it. She waited. His reply came in 6 days. It was the fastest a letter had ever come from the Vachon estate. It was also the shortest letter he had ever written. 1 page, less than 1 page, a single extended paragraph. He wrote that he had read her sentence about honesty many times. He wrote that he agreed with it. He wrote that there were things he had been honest about with himself for some time that he had not known what to do with, and that he was still not certain he knew what to do with them, but that pretending they were not there had begun to feel like a kind of dishonesty he was not comfortable with. He wrote, "I do not want to cause harm to anyone. I also do not want to keep pretending that the conversations in these letters are merely intellectual. They are the most valuable thing in my life at present. I think you should know that." That was where the letter ended. Elspeth sat for a very long time. Outside, the December snow had stopped. The garden was white and still and silent. The lavender was buried under it and would be until spring. She thought about the wedding, 4 months. 4 months and Edouard would stand at the altar in the church outside Dijon, and she would walk toward him, and they would say the words, and her life would be arranged and settled and complete. She thought about what Matthew had written, "The most valuable thing in my life at present." She thought about all the small decisions she had made before she knew she was making them. She picked up her pen, her hand was very steady. She wrote, "They are not merely intellectual, I think you should know that too." She folded the paper, she sealed it, she held it for a moment. Then she gave it to Cecile, who took it without expression and carried it away to be posted. Elspeth sat at her empty desk in the silence of the December afternoon, and for the first time since July, she allowed herself to feel clearly what she had known for a long time. It did not make anything simpler. It did not change the contract or the families or the arrangements or the spring. It changed nothing external and everything internal, the way a diagnosis changes nothing about the condition itself, but changes entirely how a person understands what they are living with. She sat there for a long time. The room grew dark, she did not light the lamp. She sat in the quiet dark and thought about a tree growing at an angle under years of prevailing wind, leaning away from what it could not control and could not leave, becoming something shaped by that tension rather than broken by it. She thought about what Matthew had written. She thought about what she had written back. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and went downstairs to dinner. She was steady at dinner. She talked about her younger brother's examination results and the plans for the East Wing renovation and a book her mother had been reading. She ate properly and thanked the cook through the correct channels and sat with her mother afterward for the usual hour before excusing herself for the night. She went upstairs. She stood at the window of her room and looked out at the white garden in the moonlight. She was going to marry Edouard Vachon in 4 months. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cold glass of the window. The letters were about books and ideas and philosophy. That was what they were about. She lifted her head, she looked at the garden. She did not know what was going to happen. She only knew that something had already happened quietly across a winter's worth of letters and arguments and a painting of a tree leaning in the wind, and that it was as real as anything she had ever known, and that real things did not stop being real because they were inconvenient. She went to bed. In the morning, she was going to need to be very practical. There was a great deal to be arranged. The wedding was 4 months away, And there were fittings and family visits and correspondence of a different kind to manage, letters about flowers and guest arrangements, and all the practical machinery of a ceremony that would happen regardless of what had occurred quietly and without permission inside her over the past several months. She was going to be practical. But for now it was night, and the garden was white and still, and she lay in the dark and let herself acknowledge, completely and without evasion, what she already knew. Then she closed her eyes. She slept better than she had in weeks. January came in hard and cold, and with it a new letter, but not from Matthew. This one was from Edouard. He wrote to Elspeth directly, which he had done only twice before, and both of those times had been brief formal notes about scheduling. This letter was longer, 3 pages. It was written in the careful, measured prose that characterized everything Edouard did, controlled and correct and precise, with nothing wasted and nothing excessive. He thanked her for the visit the previous summer. He said he hoped the winter had been kind to the Morrow household. He mentioned that the estate preparations for the spring were proceeding as planned, and that his mother was attending to the domestic arrangements with her usual thoroughness. He said he looked forward to their meeting again at the Vachon estate in February, which both families had agreed would be the final visit before the wedding. Then, in the last paragraph, he wrote something that she read 3 times before she was sure she had understood it correctly. He wrote, "I believe honesty in all things to be essential to a successful marriage, and I want you to know that I intend to give it to you. I also hope that whatever you encounter in this household, before or after our wedding, you will feel that you can be equally honest with me." That was all. He did not elaborate. He closed the letter with the correct formal phrases and his signature. Elspeth set the letter down. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what it meant that Edouard had written that specific paragraph at this specific moment. She thought about whether it meant anything at all, or whether she was reading significance into a sentence that a careful, honest man had written simply because he was a careful, honest man who intended to be a fair husband. She thought about how much Edouard knew. He lived in the same house as Matthew. He saw his brother every day. He was not by any measure an unobservant man. The letters between Elspeth and Matthew had never been secret. There was no reason for them to be secret on the surface, because on the surface they were merely correspondence between 2 people who shared an interest in ideas. But letters have weight. People who live in houses know what weight looks like. They know when someone is waiting for something, when the arrival of the post has a different quality than it did before. Edouard was not a man who missed things. She picked up the letter again and reread the final paragraph. "Whatever you encounter in this household, before or after our wedding, you will feel that you can be equally honest with me." She set it down a second time. She went to her window. The garden was still frosted and gray, no sign yet of the spring that was coming. She thought about honesty. She had been honest in the letters to Matthew, in the way people are honest through a medium that feels safer than speech, through ideas and metaphors, and the careful language of 2 people who understand each other well enough to say things sideways that they cannot say directly. She had been honest with herself, finally, on a December night with her forehead against cold glass. She had not been honest with Edouard. She had not been dishonest either, exactly. There was nothing she had done that required confession, nothing she could point to and name as a specific act. But there was something in the letters she had been writing and receiving that she would not have been entirely comfortable explaining to the man she was going to marry, and that discomfort was itself a kind of information. She wrote back to Edouard that evening. She thanked him for his letter. She said she appreciated his directness and shared his belief in honesty as the foundation of any serious arrangement. She said she looked forward to February. She sealed it. She gave it to Cecile. Then she sat at her desk for another hour thinking. The February visit was different from the July one. She knew it before the carriage even reached the estate gates. She knew it because she had spent 3 months exchanging letters with a man she was about to see in person for the first time since those letters began, and the knowledge of what those letters contained sat in her chest like a stone she was pretending was not there. The estate looked the same. The bare winter gardens, the old stone walls, the long gravel drive. Lady Vachon received her with the same measured warmth as before. Lord Vachon Sr. was, if anything, more distracted. Edouard met her in the front parlor and they talked for 40 minutes about practical things, and he was the same as he had been in July, contained, correct, not unkind, except that she was now carrying the knowledge of his letter's last paragraph, and it made talking to him feel more complicated than it had before. Matthew appeared at dinner. She had prepared herself for it. She had spent the better part of the journey from the Morrow estate constructing, with great deliberateness, the mental architecture of a woman who had a pleasant and intellectually stimulating correspondence with a soon-to-be family member, which was a normal and unremarkable thing, and who was now meeting that family member at dinner in the same pleasant and unremarkable spirit. She had constructed this architecture carefully. It collapsed approximately 3 seconds after Matthew walked into the dining room. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of a look exchanged or a word said. It collapsed because he walked into the room carrying the weight of everything the letters had said, and she could see it on him, the same weight she was carrying, and the effort of not acknowledging it was suddenly exhausting in a way she had not anticipated. He sat across from her at the table. He passed her the bread. Their eyes met for exactly as long as they would have met if they had exchanged no letters at all, and then both of them looked at other things. Lady Vachon talked about the preparations. Edouard asked Elspeth about her journey. Lord Vachon Sr. contributed a brief remark about the condition of the winter roads, and then retreated back into his private thoughts. Matthew said almost nothing through the first course. In the second course he said, "There is a book I ordered that arrived last week. It addresses the argument you made in your last letter directly. I think you will find it confirms your position, which will be disappointing for you since you will have nothing left to fight about." It was said with perfect lightness. It was said in the tone of exactly the kind of remark one future family member would make to another about a shared intellectual interest. There was nothing in the words themselves that would have looked wrong to anyone at the table. She heard everything that was underneath them anyway. She said, "I doubt that very much. Finding that I was right has never once stopped me from continuing to argue." Matthew looked at the tablecloth for a moment. Something passed across his face that was too fast for anyone who was not watching very carefully. Edouard, who was watching everything with the careful attention he applied to all things, refilled his wine glass and said nothing. The dinner ended, the evening ended. In her room that night, Elspeth sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and thought about the nature of what she was in. It was not, she thought, a situation that had a good exit. She had believed when the letters were happening that she was managing the situation, that she was keeping it contained within a space where it could not do damage. Letters about books were not a betrayal of anything. Honesty about what those letters meant, offered only to the person she was corresponding with, was not an act against anyone. She had hurt no one. She had done nothing that could be pointed to. But she was also not the woman who had arrived at this estate in July. That woman had been prepared to understand her husband and make the most of a practical arrangement, and find what satisfaction was available in a life that was reasonable even if it was not chosen. She had still believed in July that reasonable and chosen were things a person could separate cleanly and live with. She was not sure she still believed that. She thought about Edouard's letter. "Whatever you encounter in this household." She thought about what honesty required. She was not certain. She lay down on top of the bedcovers without undressing and stared at the ceiling in the dark. She was going to be here for 3 days. She was going to conduct herself correctly and return home, and the wedding was going to be in March. The wedding had always been in March. Nothing had changed about the external facts. The contract was signed. The families were agreed. The arrangements were made. She was going to get through the 3 days. She did get through them. She managed it by being very deliberate about where she was and who she was speaking to at all times. She spent mornings with Lady Vachon, discussing the practical details of the upcoming ceremony and the domestic arrangements of the estate. She spent afternoons with Edouard, who showed her the parts of the house she had not yet been given access to and who was, throughout, exactly what he had always been: measured, competent, not unkind. She met the staff who would form the household she was about to join, and she was gracious and attentive and remembered their names. She saw Matthew only at meals, and she behaved at meals the way a sensible woman behaves when the thing she cannot have is sitting directly across from her and the man she is going to marry is sitting at her right hand. She was pleasant, she was appropriate, she ate everything on her plate. On the third morning, her last morning at the estate before returning home, she came down early to find the house still quiet. She went to the library, which had become her habit on this visit, to sit with her book before the household woke. He was already there. He was standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the frost-covered garden, and he turned when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then he said, "I wanted to apologize for the dinner comment, the one about the book." She said, "You do not need to apologize for it." He said, "I know, but I wanted to say it anyway." Another pause. She came into the room and sat down in the chair nearest the door, not the chair she usually chose, and opened her book without actually reading it. He stayed at the window. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am." He said, "That is not what I meant." She looked up from the page. He was watching her with the expression she had first seen that July afternoon when she had come into this room and caught him mid-thought, the expression that moved too much to be contained. She said very quietly, "I know what you meant." He nodded. He looked back out at the garden. He said, "I will not make this harder than it is. That is not something I am willing to do." She said, "I know that too." They sat in silence for a few minutes. It was not uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that settles between two people who understand each other well enough that silence is sufficient. Then she said, "The letters have been the best conversations I have had in years." He said, "For me as well." She said, "I want you to know I do not regret them." He turned from the window and looked at her. He looked at her in the way he always looked at things. He was genuinely trying to understand, openly, and without pretense, and with a focus that most people found too direct to be comfortable. He said, "I don't regret them either." She held that for a moment, then she looked back down at her book. Neither of them said anything further. The household woke around them, slowly, and after another 20 minutes she excused herself to prepare for the journey home. She did not look back at him when she left the library. In the carriage, watching the estate gates recede through the back window, she thought about the 3 days she had just lived through and what they had told her. They had told her something she did not particularly want to know and could not now unknow. They had told her that the distance of letters had allowed her to believe she was managing something that she was not, in fact, managing. They had told her that the thing she had thought was a correspondence about books was actually a correspondence about the specific understanding that exists between two people who have found in each other something they had not found before and may not find again. The carriage moved through the winter fields. She thought about Edouard's letter. She thought about Matthew standing at the window with his coffee and his careful honesty. She thought about the wedding in March. She pressed her hands together in her lap and thought, with great clarity and very little comfort, about what she was going to do. She did not know. She had never in her life not known something she needed to know, and the not knowing sat inside her like weather, like something building at a distance that had not yet arrived. The fields passed, the carriage moved south, February settled around her, cold and gray and without answer. There is a servant account that survived. It was not unusual, in households of that era and class, for domestic staff to keep private records, not official ones, not documents filed with solicitors or placed in estate archives, but personal notes written in the hours between duties, observations gathered over years of working in close proximity to people who rarely thought about who was watching. Most of these accounts were never shared beyond the household. Many were destroyed. A few passed quietly through family lines until they arrived, much later, in the hands of a researcher or a grandchild with a question. This account belonged to a man named Aldrich Pons, who served as the senior house steward at the Vachon estate for nearly 30 years, beginning in 1872 and ending upon his retirement in 1901. He was, by all indications, a careful and discreet man, the kind of person who becomes indispensable to a household precisely because he sees everything and says nothing and never confuses his own observations with his own business. He kept his record in a small leather notebook that he carried in his coat pocket, and he wrote in it every Sunday evening without fail, in the compressed, efficient prose of a man accustomed to managing many things with limited time. His account of the period between July 1887 and March 1888 runs to 42 pages of that notebook. It is, if you know what you are reading, one of the most precise accounts of a household in distress that exists from that period. He noted with the unadorned economy that characterized all his writing that the autumn of 1887 had been a quiet one at the estate, but that quiet at the Vachon estate was never without a particular quality. He noted that the volume of correspondence leaving the estate had increased, and that the post was collected on certain mornings with a regularity and attention that he had not previously observed in Monsieur Matthew's habits. He noted that Monsieur Matthew, who was ordinarily the kind of young man who forgot to eat when he was thinking about something interesting, had begun arriving at meals precisely on time. He noted, without comment, that Lord Edouard had asked him in October whether it was usual for correspondence to flow between the estate and the Morrow household with such frequency. Aldrich had said yes, that it seemed to be becoming usual. Edouard had said nothing further and gone back to his desk. That exchange appears in the notebook in 2 lines. What is not in the notebook, what Aldrich was either not present for or chose not to record, is what Edouard did after that conversation. What is in the notebook is the observation, 1 week later, that Lord Edouard had spent an evening in the library alone, which was unusual for him, as he preferred to work at his desk in the study. Aldrich had gone in to tend the fire at 10 in the evening, and found Edouard sitting in the chair by the window that Matthew usually occupied, not reading, not working, simply sitting with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the garden. Aldrich had tended the fire. Edouard had said, "Do you think a man can know something for a long time before he acknowledges it to himself?" Aldrich had said, "I expect so, my lord, most things worth knowing take time." Edouard had nodded. He had said, "Yes, I think that is probably right." That was the whole exchange. Aldrich recorded it on the following Sunday with the same compression he applied to everything. To understand what Edouard knew, and when he knew it, you have to understand the man first. This is something several people attempted over the years, with varying degrees of success, and the consistent difficulty they encountered was that Edouard Vachon was extraordinarily difficult to know. Not because he was cold exactly, not because he was unkind, but because he had built, over the course of his life, a quality of containment so complete and so thoroughly practiced that it had become indistinguishable from his actual personality, and even the people closest to him were not always sure where the containment ended and the person began. His mother, who loved him and was not easily deceived about things she chose to look at clearly, said of him once, in a private letter to a friend that survived in the friend's family papers, "Edouard understands everything and permits himself to feel very little. I do not know whether this is strength or loss. I have never been able to ask him." His father, who was less subtle, had said of him, in Aldrich's hearing on a morning in the summer of 1886, "The boy never complains. It is either admirable or worrying. I have never been certain which." Matthew, who knew his brother better than most, had said to a university friend in a letter written the year before the engagement was arranged, "Edouard sees things with complete clarity, processes them with complete control, and then presents you with the conclusion as though it arrived without any of the work. I have never once known him to be caught off guard. I find it equally impressive and frightening." What all of these observations share is a quality of watching, the sense of people who are close to Edouard and are paying close attention, and are still not entirely sure what they are looking at. What Edouard knew, and when, is therefore a matter that has to be assembled from evidence rather than from his own account, because Edouard left very little in the way of personal record, and what he did leave was characteristically contained. There are 3 facts that bear examination. The first is the letter he wrote to Elspeth in January, with its unusual final paragraph about honesty. The letter was written in Edouard's normal voice and his normal style, but the final paragraph was different in quality, less formal, more direct, less like a formal note, and more like the kind of thing a man says when he is trying to communicate something important without being certain how to say it. The timing of that letter, coming after several months of regular correspondence between Elspeth and Matthew, is not easily explained as coincidence. The second is a conversation between Edouard and Matthew that Aldrich did not directly witness, but which he recorded on the basis of indirect observation. On a morning in late November, Aldrich noted that both brothers had been in the study together for approximately 2 hours with the door closed, which was unusual, as Edouard and Matthew generally moved through the same house with an ease that did not require formal meetings. When they emerged, Matthew had left the house on horseback immediately, without eating lunch. Edouard had returned to his desk and worked until dinner without pause. Aldrich wrote, "The household felt different after this. The particular quality of the quiet changed." The third is what Aldrich observed in February, when Elspeth visited. He had watched over the course of the 3-day visit, with the attention of a man who has spent a lifetime noticing the things that other people overlook. He watched at meals. He watched in the corridors. He watched the way people moved through rooms and the quality of the silences between them and the small adjustments a body makes when it is near something it wants and is working very hard not to want. He wrote in his notebook on the Sunday after Elspeth left, "There is a situation in this house. Lord Edouard knows it. He has, I think, known it for some time. What I do not know is what he intends to do about it, if anything. He is not a man who acts without thinking, and he is not a man who thinks without arriving at a conclusion. I expect he has arrived at one. I wait to see what it is." That observation sits in Aldrich's notebook in the same careful, neutral prose as everything else, sandwiched between a note about a broken window latch in the east wing and a reminder about the wine delivery expected the following week. Aldrich did not rank things by importance. Everything that happened in his household happened at the same level of attention. What Edouard had concluded, and when, and what he intended to do about it, these are the questions that the rest of the story answers, but the answers come later and from outside, from what happened rather than from what Edouard said about what he was thinking. What can be said about Edouard, with confidence, based on the account that Aldrich kept and the few other records that exist from this period, is this. He was a man who understood his situation with considerable clarity. He had watched his brother with close attention since July and had seen what was happening with the particular precision of a man who sees clearly and does not permit himself to look away. He had known, perhaps, even before the letters began, had known from the afternoon in the parlor when both Matthew and Elspeth had forgotten he was present, had known from the way the room changed when they were in it together, had known with the specific clarity of a man who has never lied to himself about things he does not want to know. He was also a man who did not believe in scenes, who did not raise his voice, who did not make demands or ultimatums or dramatic gestures, who processed what was in front of him with enormous interior effort and presented the result with a face that gave nothing away. He was, in short, a man who was doing something very hard and making it look very easy. Whether there was something else underneath all of that, something that the containment was protecting, something of his own that the situation had touched, is harder to establish from the record. There are hints. The evening Aldrich found him sitting in Matthew's chair, staring at the garden. The note in Aldrich's account about the particular quality of the quiet after the November meeting with his brother. The final paragraph of the letter to Elspeth, which lands differently once you know what it was written in the context of. A man does not write about honesty in a marriage unless honesty is on his mind. A man who writes about it when his brother is corresponding with his betrothed is writing about something specific, even if he does not name it. Edouard sat with his situation through the autumn and into the winter. He watched the letters go and come. He watched his brother's face at meals and his own face in the mirror when he thought about the spring. He watched Elspeth's face during the February visit with the attention of a man taking an inventory. He watched all of it. And then, at some point in February, after Elspeth had returned to the Morrow estate and the house had settled back into its winter quiet, Edouard made a decision. Aldrich did not know what it was, not yet. He wrote in his notebook that Edouard seemed, in the days following February's visit, different in some way he could not precisely name, not disturbed, not angry, not anything so readable as that. He seemed, Aldrich wrote, settled. In the way that a person seems settled after they have made a decision they have been struggling with for a long time, and have arrived at an answer they can live with. He wrote, "I do not know what he has decided, but he has decided something. Lord Edouard always looks like this when he has arrived somewhere, very still, very certain. There is no point asking. He will tell you what you need to know when he is ready to tell you and not before." Aldrich closed his notebook. He put it in his coat pocket. He went to check on the broken window latch in the east wing. In the study, Edouard sat at his desk and looked at a blank sheet of paper. He was not, as it happened, composing a letter. He was simply sitting and thinking with the complete and methodical attention he gave to everything. There were 3 letters to write, though he had not decided that yet, not in those terms. There was the letter to his father, which would need to be carefully worded. There was the letter to his solicitor, which would be precise and legal and would take less than a page. And there was a third letter, which he picked up his pen to begin and then set the pen down again, and sat for another hour without writing, because the third letter was not something he knew how to write simply, and Edouard Vachon did not begin things he could not do correctly. He would write it eventually. Whether he ever sent it was a different question. For now he sat in the quiet study with the winter light on the desk and the blank paper in front of him, and he sat with the decision he had made, which was the heaviest and most important thing he had ever decided, and which he had arrived at after months of careful thought, in the way he arrived at all conclusions, completely and without drama, and with the particular kind of peace that comes not from happiness but from clarity. He knew what was true. He knew what he was going to do. He picked up his pen. He began. The night before the wedding, Edouard called his brother to his study at 9 o'clock. Matthew knew, walking down the corridor toward the study, that the conversation was going to be something he had been waiting for and dreading since November. He knew it the way you know weather before it arrives, not from what you see but from something that changes in the air, a pressure shift, a quality of stillness that precedes the thing itself. He had been waiting for Edouard to speak directly since the morning after Elspeth's February visit, when he had come down to breakfast and found his brother looking exactly the way Edouard looked when he had decided something, and had understood immediately that the decision had been made about something that directly involved him. He knocked. Edouard said to come in. Matthew opened the door. The study was a room he had known all his life, and it had always been more Edouard's room than any other space in the house. The books on the shelves were Edouard's books, legal texts, agricultural treatises, household management, the practical literature of a man who understood responsibility as the central fact of his existence. The desk was the same desk their father had used for 40 years before Edouard assumed management of the estate, and Edouard sat at it now the way he sat everywhere, straight-backed, composed, completely present. He looked at Matthew when he came in. He said, "Sit down." Matthew sat. He waited. Edouard did not begin immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands on the desk in front of him, and he looked at his brother with the focused attention he gave to everything important. And Matthew, who had known Edouard his entire life, sat very still and did not attempt to fill the silence. Edouard said, "I am going to say something to you, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond." Matthew said, "All right." Edouard said, "I know what has happened this past year. I want you to understand that I am not saying this as an accusation. I am saying it because I am not a man who pretends not to see what is directly in front of him, and what has been in front of me for the past several months has been clear enough that pretending would be absurd." He paused. He said, "I know what the letters were. I know what they meant. I know what Elspeth feels, and I know what you feel, and I have had since February to arrive at a clear understanding of what I am looking at." Matthew said nothing. His hands were very still in his lap. Edouard said, "I want to ask you a direct question and I want a direct answer." Matthew said, "Ask it." Edouard said, "If you had met her first, under different circumstances, would you have pursued this?" The room was quiet. Matthew looked at his brother. He looked at him for a long moment, and he thought about all the ways he could answer the question that were honest without being complete, and he thought about what Edouard had said about not pretending to see what was directly in front of him, and he thought about the fact that his brother had brought him into this room and asked this specific question at 9 o'clock on the night before his wedding. He said, "Yes." Edouard received this without moving. He sat with it for a moment, then he said, "And does she know that?" Matthew said, "I think she does, yes." Edouard looked down at the desk. He looked at his own hands, which were as still as ever. He was not, Matthew thought, performing composure. He was simply someone who had already worked through all of this at some interior level, and had arrived here having already done the hardest part of it alone. He said, "I have spent a long time thinking about what is right in this situation, not what is convenient or expected or what the contract requires, what is actually right." He paused. "I have come to a conclusion." Matthew waited. Edouard said, "I am not going to pretend that I am the right person for her. I know what I am. I know what kind of husband I would make, and I know what kind of husband she deserves, and those two things are not the same thing." He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way a man states a fact he has examined from every angle and found to be simply true. She deserves someone who argues with her. Someone who wants to be in the same room with her because of who she is, not because of what the arrangement requires. I can do my duty to her, Matthew. I can be a correct and fair and faithful husband, but that is not the same thing. Matthew was very still. Edouard said, I also know what I am not able to do. I am not able to tell her any of this myself because it is not the kind of conversation I know how to have, and I would do it badly, and she deserves better than badly. He lifted his eyes to Matthew's face. What I can do is something else. The clock on the mantelpiece counted the seconds. Matthew said very quietly, What are you asking me? Edouard said, I am not asking you anything. I am telling you what I have decided. Tomorrow I will not be at the altar. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Matthew said, Edouard. Edouard said, I have thought about this for longer than you know and from more angles than I can explain to you in the time we have. This is not a decision I have made lightly or quickly. It is a decision I have made correctly. He looked at his brother without any particular expression, or rather with the expression that was simply Edouard, complete and unreachable and fully himself. You will stand in my place. The ceremony will proceed. What happens after that is between you and Elspeth, and whatever you choose to do with what you have. Matthew stood up. He did not know when he had stood up, but he was standing. He said, You cannot do this. The families, the contract, there will be consequences that. Edouard said, I know the consequences. I have looked at all of them. I will manage them. He said it without any change in tone, as though managing the consequences of the largest social and legal disruption his family had experienced in a generation was simply another item on the list of things he intended to handle. My concern is not the families. My concern is her. Matthew sat down again. His hands were shaking slightly, which he noticed and could not stop. He said, You are certain. Edouard said, I have never been uncertain about anything I have said to you tonight. A long silence. Matthew looked at his brother, really looked at him, the way he had not been able to do for months because looking too directly at Edouard during these months had felt like looking at something he had caused and could not fix. He looked at him now and tried to find, in the composed and contained and controlled face across the desk, some evidence of the cost of what this was. He could not find it. That was not because the cost was not there. It was because Edouard was made the way he was made, and what was inside was not a thing he could show. Matthew said, What about you? Edouard looked at him. He said, I will manage. Matthew said, That is not what I asked. A pause, a very long one. Edouard looked at the desk, then he looked back up. He said, Go to bed, Matthew. You will need to sleep. It was a dismissal, but not a cold one. It was the kind of thing a person says when they have gone as far as they are able to go in one evening and need to be finished. Matthew stood. He crossed to the door. He had his hand on the frame when he stopped. He said, You should know, whatever you think about what this is or what it means, you should know that you are a better man than most people understand. Edouard said very quietly, Go to bed. Matthew went. He did not sleep. He lay in his room in the dark and he stared at the ceiling, and he heard the clock in the hall count the hours, and he thought about what Edouard had said and what it meant, and what was going to happen in the morning, and he felt the weight of everything shift into a new arrangement, one he had not prepared for and did not know how to carry. He thought about Elspeth. He thought about her arriving at the church tomorrow in the carriage from the Morrow estate, in the dress that had been fitted and prepared and made ready for a ceremony she had agreed to and signed her name for. He thought about what it would mean to her to walk into that church and find him at the altar instead of his brother. He did not know what she would do. He thought he knew. He had been fairly certain since December of what Elspeth felt, because Elspeth was not a woman who said things without meaning them, and what she had said in that last letter had been said with the same precision and honesty she brought to everything. But knowing what a person feels, and knowing what they will do when the moment is suddenly real and immediate and impossible to retreat from, are not the same kind of knowing. She might turn around. She had every reason to turn around. The families would be furious. There would be no clean resolution. Her father's financial situation depended on the alliance, and the alliance depended on a Vachon Morrow marriage, and a Morrow younger brother Vachon marriage was not necessarily the same thing, legally or socially, and she would know all of this, would have known it before she had taken 5 steps down the aisle. She might turn around. He lay in the dark, and he thought about that possibility with complete honesty, the way he thought about all things he was genuinely trying to understand. He thought about what Edouard had said. He thought about what it had cost to say it. He pressed his hands flat against the bed and breathed slowly and steadily, and he thought, whatever she does, it is her choice to make. His brother had given them a choice. What they did with it was theirs. At some point before dawn, he fell into a short and dreamless sleep. He was awake before the household. He dressed in the dark. The clock in the hall struck 6. The morning of the wedding had begun. Elspeth Morrow had not slept particularly well the night before her wedding. This was not, she told herself as she lay in the familiar darkness of her bedroom at the Morrow estate, unusual. She had heard from both her sisters that wedding eve nerves were a common enough experience, and that they did not indicate anything significant about the marriage itself. Nerves were simply the body's response to change, and change, however arranged and anticipated, still required adjustment. She lay very still and told herself this. Then she lay very still and thought with complete honesty about the fact that the nerves she was feeling were not the same nerves her sisters had described. Her sisters had been nervous about the day itself, the ceremony, the crowd, the precision required of them in public. What Elspeth was feeling was not a fear of performing incorrectly. She had no anxiety about the ceremony or the crowd. She was perfectly capable of walking down an aisle in front of 200 people without dropping anything. What she was feeling was something else. Something that had not diminished over the months since February but had instead grown heavier and more present. The way a stone in a coat pocket grows heavier the longer you carry it, not because it changes, but because your awareness of it becomes complete. She had not heard from Matthew since she left the estate in February. The letters had stopped. This was not discussed, was not acknowledged, was simply the thing that had happened as the wedding approached. The correspondence that had been the center of an entire autumn and winter had simply ceased. The way a river ceases when it reaches the sea, absorbed into something larger and quieter and without a clear direction. She did not know if this had been his decision, or simply the inevitable consequence of the approach of the thing they had been circling around for months. She got up before her maid arrived. She stood at the window and watched the early March dawn come in over the fields, pale and cold and very clear, with that particular quality of morning light that makes everything look both very distant and very sharp. She stood there for a long time. Her maid came at 7. The process of dressing began with the particular organized solemnity that had been rehearsed twice in the preceding week. The dress, ivory silk, long-sleeved, high-necked in the mode of the time, with a train that required management, was carefully assembled around her. Her hair was arranged. Her mother appeared in the doorway at 8 and stood watching with an expression that Elspeth recognized as the face her mother made when she was feeling something significant and was deciding whether to say it. Her mother did not say it. She came in and adjusted one small thing about Elspeth's collar, and then she held Elspeth's hands for a moment in the way she had held them when Elspeth was young and anxious about something, which was not often, but which she remembered. She said, "You look beautiful." Elspeth said, "Thank you, Mother." Her mother held her hands for another moment, and then released them, and went downstairs to manage the household's departure for the church. Elspeth looked at herself in the glass. The woman in the mirror was wearing all the correct things. The dress was right, the hair was right, the expression was right or near enough. She looked like a woman who was dressed for a wedding, which she was. She looked like a woman who had arrived at the expected destination by the expected route. She looked exactly like what the morning required her to be. She held the woman in the mirror's gaze for a long moment. Then she went downstairs. The carriages arrived at the church in the village outside Dijon at 10:30. The church was old 12th century stone, much added to over the centuries, settled into the landscape the way very old things settle, with the presence of something that has outlasted everything built around it. The Vachon family worshipped there. It was, in every sense, the correct place for this ceremony. The guests were already inside when the Morrow carriages arrived. 200 people, approximately, representing both families and the social world they inhabited, local nobility, neighbors, friends, the various professional relationships that both families maintained, and a small number of people who had come simply because the event was significant and attendance was expected. Elspeth did not see the crowd. She was aware of it the way you are aware of weather, as a fact of the environment rather than a particular focus of attention. Her father took her arm at the church door. He was wearing his best coat. He had spent the previous evening in his study, and she had heard him moving around later than usual, which was not typical for him. She did not know what he had been thinking. He was not a man who discussed interior life. He had arranged her marriage with the calm practicality of a man who understood the world to be a system of necessities, and he had done it because it needed to be done, and she had never resented him for it, and she did not resent him now. She took his arm. The church doors opened. The music began low and formal, and filling the old stone space with the particular resonance that old stone gives to sound. She felt her father's arm steady under her hand, and she took the first step inside. The church was full of candlelight and flowers, and the gathered breath of 200 people. She looked forward. She had taken perhaps 12 steps down the aisle when she understood. It was not a sudden understanding. It came to her in increments, the way the misapprehension collapsed, one piece at a time, each piece arriving a step ahead of the next, so that by the time she was certain, she had already known for several seconds. The man at the altar was the wrong height. This was the first thing. Edouard was slightly taller, and what she had seen from the doorway had triggered something very small in her perception, not enough to stop her, not enough to name, but enough to create a texture in her awareness, a slight wrongness that her mind began to work on as she walked. The second thing was the shoulders. The way a person carries themselves in their shoulders is distinctive in the way that handwriting is distinctive, not dramatic, not obvious, but absolutely particular to that person. She had watched Matthew move through rooms and sit at tables and stand at windows for 4 days across 2 visits, and she knew the way he stood, and the man at the altar stood that way. The third thing was when she was close enough to see his face. She stopped walking. Her father stopped beside her. She felt his arm tighten slightly, a question transmitted through physical contact. Matthew was standing at the altar in his brother's place. He was wearing a coat she had not seen before, which was Edouard's. She recognized the cut, which was Edouard's tailor's work, and his hands were at his sides very still, and he was looking directly at her with the expression she recognized from the library in February, and from the dining table, and from every conversation in every letter, the expression that moved and showed itself and could not be contained. His hands were shaking slightly. She knew because she was close enough to see it. The guests behind her were silent, not the silence of people who have gone quiet because something is about to happen, but the silence of 200 people who have simultaneously understood that something has already happened and are waiting to discover what it means. Her father's arm was still under her hand. She stood still and she looked at Matthew at the altar, and she thought about everything. She thought about it very quickly because the moment required quickness, but she thought about it completely. The contract, the families, her father's financial situation, the social implications, the fact that she was standing in a church full of witnesses in a dress that had taken 3 months to make, and on the other side of all of that, on the far side of every practical and legal and social fact, she thought about a man who had written to her about a painting of a tree growing at an angle under prevailing wind, and about what it meant to acknowledge honestly the things you had already decided before you knew you were deciding. She thought about what honesty required. She thought about Edouard's letter, whatever you encounter in this household. She thought about what it had cost to write it, what it had cost to arrange this. She took the last steps. She stood in front of Matthew. She looked at him. His hands were still shaking. His face was the open, moving, visible thing it always was, showing everything, performing nothing, looking at her with the complete and undefended attention he had given her since the first afternoon in the library. She reached out and took his right hand in both of hers. She held it still. She said very quietly so that only he could hear, "Are you all right?" He exhaled. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, and it was the most honest sound she had ever heard from another person. He said, "Not particularly." She said, "Neither am I." He said, "What do you want to do?" She held his hand. She looked at him. She thought about the woman in the mirror that morning, the woman wearing all the correct things, looking exactly like what the moment required. She said, "I want to do this." He looked at her for a long moment. The priest who had been standing at the altar through this exchange, with the expression of a man who has been a priest for 40 years, and has seen a great many things, cleared his throat very gently. Elspeth turned toward him. She nodded. The ceremony began. Behind her, she heard the shift in the gathered room, 200 people adjusting to what they had just witnessed, some with confusion, some with understanding, some with the particular energy of people who know they are witnessing something they will tell stories about for the rest of their lives. She heard someone, she thought it was her eldest sister, make a small and quickly suppressed sound. She did not turn around. She stood at the altar in her ivory dress and held Matthew Vachon's hand and looked forward and did not turn around. The priest spoke the opening words. His voice was steady and formal and old, the words worn smooth by repetition into something that no longer required attention to be received, and she received them without quite hearing them, because what she was actually hearing was the sound of her own heartbeat, very clear in the candle-lit quiet of the old stone church, and the feeling of Matthew's hand in hers, which had stopped shaking. Outside, the March morning continued. The light was still very clear, the fields were still bare. Inside the church, something permanent was beginning. The reception that followed the ceremony was one of the strangest social occasions Aldrich Pons had ever managed, and he had managed a great many of them over the course of his career. He noted in his notebook that evening, the guests behaved as though they were not certain whether they were celebrating something or waiting to be told what they had seen. Most of them ate and drank and spoke to one another with the slightly heightened animation of people who are performing normalcy and know it. A small number left early, which was expected. The remainder stayed the correct amount of time and departed with the particular care of people who have decided to form their opinion of events after further consideration. The Morau family presented various responses. Count Armand Morau, Elspeth's father, had arrived at the church with his usual controlled bearing and had departed from it with slightly less of it. He had not said anything during the ceremony. He had sat in the front pew and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who is processing information that he has not been given time to prepare for, and is doing so at speed, and is not entirely finished by the time he is required to respond. He had spoken briefly to Lady Vachon after the ceremony, and to Matthew, and had shaken Matthew's hand, which Aldrich observed from across the room and filed away. He did not speak to Elspeth immediately after the ceremony, which Elspeth noticed and Aldrich noted, and neither of them remarked upon. The eldest Morau sister, whose name was Cecile, had cried twice during the ceremony, which might have meant happiness and might have meant something else, and no one asked her to clarify. The younger sister, Beatrice, had asked Aldrich in a low voice approximately 15 minutes into the reception whether Lord Edouard was expected to attend, and Aldrich had said he did not know, which was the truth. Edouard did not attend the reception. This was not in the context of what had happened particularly surprising, where he was during the ceremony and the reception was a question that circulated through the guests with varying degrees of discretion for the remainder of the day. Aldrich knew where he was, because managing the movements of the household was his concern, and he had seen Edouard's travel case in the entrance hall that morning before the carriages departed for the church, and had understood what it meant. Edouard had left the estate before the ceremony began. He had left early enough that the house was still quiet when he went, and only Aldrich, who rose before everyone as a matter of professional habit, had seen him go. He had been carrying the travel case himself rather than asking for help with it, which was characteristic. He had paused at the front entrance and looked back at the hall for a moment, the old stone hall with its inherited portraits and its winter morning light coming through the east window, and then he had opened the door and walked out, and the carriage he had arranged had been waiting on the drive, and he had gotten in, and the carriage had moved away down the long gravel approach and through the gates and out of Aldrich's sight. Aldrich had stood at the window and watched it go. Then he had gone to prepare the house for the wedding party's return. The reception ended in the early evening. The guests departed. The Morau family remained for one additional hour, which was somewhat longer than comfortable, and then their carriages were called and they assembled at the door. Count Armand Morau stopped before he left and spoke to Matthew privately in the entrance hall for approximately 6 minutes, which Aldrich tracked from a respectful distance out of professional interest. He did not record what was said because he could not hear it, but he noted that Matthew listened without speaking for most of those 6 minutes, and that when the Count finished, Matthew said something brief, and that the Count looked at him for a long moment and then shook his hand again, more firmly than the first time, and left. Elspeth said goodbye to her family in the usual way. She embraced her mother, who held her slightly longer than usual, and kissed her sisters, and stood with her father for a moment at the door. Her father looked at her. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Are you certain?" She said, "I am." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, in the way a man nods when he has received an answer he is going to have to take at face value, because it is the only answer being offered, and he descended the steps to his carriage. The last vehicle moved down the drive, the gates closed. Elspeth stood in the doorway of the Vachon estate, her estate now, in the legal and practical sense, though it would take some time before it felt like any such thing, and watched the light on the gravel where the carriages had been. Then she went inside. Matthew was in the library, of course he was. He had a glass of wine on the table beside him, and a book open on his knee that he was not reading, and he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who is not sure what the next hour contains, and is trying to be prepared for all possibilities. She sat down in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke immediately. Then he said, "How are you?" She said, "I am not entirely sure yet." He said, "That is an honest answer." She said, "I thought it was probably time to be honest." He almost smiled, then he said more quietly, "I need to ask you something." She said, "Ask it." He said, "In the church, before you answered, was there a moment when you thought about turning around?" She looked at him steadily. She said, "There was a moment before I took the last steps." He said, "What did you think about in that moment?" She said, "I thought about everything, your brother, my family, the contract. I thought about all of it very quickly." He waited. She said, "And then I thought about a letter you wrote in December, about a tree growing at an angle under prevailing wind, and I thought about what honest things cost, and I thought about your brother writing to me about honesty and what it meant, and I thought about the fact that there are decisions a person makes before they know they are making them." She stopped. She said, "I had made mine in December." The library was quiet around them. The fire moved in the grate. Matthew set down his wine glass. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at her. He said, "I owe you the whole truth, not just the convenient part of it." She said, "Tell me." He told her about Edouard calling him to the study the night before. He told her the conversation as completely as he could remember it, what Edouard had said, and how he had said it and what it had cost, which Matthew could measure even if the cost was never made visible in Edouard's face. He told her about lying awake through the night. He told her about dressing in the dark and standing at the altar with his hands trying not to shake and watching the church door for the moment she would appear. He told her all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He did that." It was not a question. Matthew said he did. She looked at the fire. She thought about Edouard sitting in his study on the evening before the ceremony, writing what he had written, arranging what he had arranged, carrying what he had decided alone, and with that extraordinary, exhausting, contained quality he brought to everything. She thought about his letter, "I believe honesty in all things to be essential, whatever you encounter." She thought about what he had seen from close proximity all autumn and all winter, and what he had done with it. She said, "He is a remarkable person." Matthew said, "Yes, he is." She said, "I hope he knows that we know it." Matthew said, "I told him last night. He told me to go to bed." She almost laughed. It was a small sound, not quite a laugh, but something close to it. The first sound in the past 24 hours that had felt like it came from inside her rather than from the layer of managed composure she had been maintaining since the previous morning. He looked at her when she made that sound. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, open and interested, and without performance. He said, "We are going to need to handle a great deal in the coming days. The families, the legal situation, my brother's absence." She said, "I know." He said, "It will not be simple." She said, "I did not think it would be." He said, "But we are going to handle it." She looked at him. She said, "We are going to handle it." The fire burned steadily in the grate. The old house settled around them with the faint sounds that old houses make at night, wood and stone contracting in the cooling air, the small living sounds of a building that has been standing for 200 years and expects to stand for 200 more. They sat in the library in the quiet evening, and what was between them was not romantic drama or theatrical declaration. because neither of them was that kind of person. What was between them was something older and quieter and more durable, the particular quality of two people who have arrived after a long and difficult and honest journey at the same place at the same time, and who understand, without having to say it plainly, that they are standing on solid ground. The difficult part was still ahead of them. The families, the scandal, the legal questions, the social aftermath, all of it was waiting in the world beyond the library door, and they both knew it. For now it was evening, the fire was warm, the library smelled of old paper and lavender from a dried bunch in the corner window. Outside, the March dark had settled over the fields and the old estate, and the long gravel drive where the carriages had been. They sat in the library and talked until late, not about the wedding or the contract or what the morning would bring. They talked the way they had always talked, the way the letters had always moved, about books, about ideas, about the difference between things that are true and things that are merely defensible, about the philosophical texts they had been arguing about since July. At some point, without either of them marking when it happened, the conversation became simply the two of them, in a room together, without the distance of paper and ink between them. It was the first time that had been true. They did not remark on it. They did not need to. The news reached Paris in 4 days, which was faster than anyone at the Vachon estate had calculated. This was partly a function of how many people had been in the church, and partly a function of what people do when they have witnessed something unusual. They write letters, and they make visits, and they speak at dinners with the particular energy of someone conveying significant information, and each telling adds detail and emphasis until by the time the story reaches the 4th or 5th degree of removal from the original event, it has become something considerably larger and more dramatic than what actually occurred. What actually occurred was this. At a scheduled wedding ceremony in the church outside Dijon on the 4th of March, 1888, the groom's younger brother stood at the altar in the groom's place, and the bride, after a brief pause, took his hand and went through with the ceremony. The groom was absent and had arranged the substitution himself. What the Paris drawing rooms received was a version that involved considerably more scandal, several invented conversations, a dramatic scene between the brothers that no one had witnessed because it had not happened, and a great deal of speculation about the nature of what had been happening at the Vachon estate over the preceding months. Matthew and Elspeth became aware of the stories within a week. It was not possible to be unaware of them, because the stories came back to them through the natural channels, through letters from family members and acquaintances, through the careful and sometimes less careful observations of neighbors, and through the social temperature of the region, which had shifted in a way that was perceptible even without direct communication. They handled this as they handled everything, together, practically, and with the application of the same intelligence they brought to arguments about philosophy. The first priority was the legal situation. The marriage contract had named Edouard Vachon specifically, and its validity was immediately contested by a member of the Moreau family, not Count Armand, who had made his position clear by shaking Matthew's hand at the reception, but a cousin who had attended the wedding and who saw in the situation an opportunity to advance a separate family claim against the Moreau estate that had nothing directly to do with the marriage at all. The solicitors spent 6 weeks establishing that the marriage had taken place, that both parties had consented, and that the original purpose of the contract, an alliance between the Moreau and Vachon families, had been achieved, albeit not in the form originally specified. It was not simple. It involved 3 separate legal opinions, 2 of which disagreed with each other, and a period of considerable uncertainty during which both families lived with the knowledge that the legal standing of the marriage was not yet confirmed. Matthew's inheritance from the Vachon estate was a separate question. As the younger son, he held a specific portion of the family property and income as arranged in the original family settlement, and none of this had changed. The situation was complicated by Edouard's departure, which had left the management of the estate's primary holdings temporarily unresolved. Lord Vachon Sr. was not, at this stage of his life, in a position to assume active management, and Lady Vachon, while entirely capable of making decisions, was also managing the additional burden of the social situation, the family correspondence, and the need to present the Vachon household as composed, and in order to a world that was watching it very closely. Matthew stepped into the management of the estate. This was not what he would have chosen. He was a scholar, not an estate manager. He had spent his adult life with books and ideas and the kind of intellectual work that took place at a desk, and the practical administration of 200 acres and a household of significant size was a different thing entirely. He was not bad at it. This surprised him, and it surprised Elspeth somewhat less, because she had understood from the beginning that the intelligence Matthew applied to ideas was the same intelligence that applied to any problem presented with sufficient complexity. She helped him. She had grown up in a household that needed management, and her mother had made sure she understood how households actually operated, not as an abstract matter but in the practical daily detail. She knew how accounts worked and how staff needed to be organized and how decisions about a property's upkeep operated across a financial year. She applied this knowledge without drama, simply arriving in the mornings with the accounts or the correspondence or the particular difficulty of the day, and working through it with him. Lady Vachon watched this happen with the attentive regard of a woman who is updating her understanding of a situation she had not previously assessed accurately. She had known Elspeth only as the fiancée of her elder son, a young woman who was suitably connected and reportedly intelligent, which she had regarded as secondary to the practical requirements of the arrangement. She had not had the opportunity to see Elspeth as something in her own right. She revised her opinion over the course of that first spring. She revised it several times. By the end of March, she had arrived at a settled assessment that she did not share with anyone, but that was visible to Aldrich, who noted in his notebook that Lady Vachon's manner toward the new Madame Vachon had shifted from polite, but measured to something that would not have been out of place between two people who genuinely respected each other. This was, in the circumstances, no small thing. The correspondence from the outside world required sustained attention. There were letters from every direction, from guests who had been at the wedding and needed their understanding confirmed, from acquaintances who had heard the stories and wanted accurate information, from family members on both sides who had feelings about the situation and expressed them with varying degrees of tact. Matthew and Elspeth dealt with each letter as it arrived, deciding together who should respond and what should be said, which was a process that suited both of them because it required the same combination of precision and judgment that they applied to everything. A note from a cousin of the Vachon family on the subject of propriety, arriving 3 weeks after the wedding, required a particularly careful response. The cousin was older and influential in the social world of Burgundy and had expressed her concerns in language that managed to be both formal and pointed. Matthew's first draft response was intelligent and accurate, and Elspeth noted, too defensive in the third paragraph. He read her note on it. He said, "You are right about the third paragraph." She said, "I usually am." He said, "I am going to need to get used to that." She said, "You have had 9 months of letters to prepare." He said, "That is a fair point." They rewrote the third paragraph together. The letter went out that afternoon. This was how the spring proceeded, not dramatically, not with the high register of theatrical crisis, though there was genuine difficulty, and there were days when the weight of the situation required more endurance than either of them was certain they had. But they met each difficulty as it arrived, with honesty and practical intelligence, and the specific advantage of two people who had spent 9 months learning how each other thought, so that working together was not an adjustment they had to make, but a fact they had already established. The legal matter was resolved in late April. The marriage was confirmed. The cousin's challenge was dismissed. The Morrow financial alliance with the Vachon family was recognized as intact, which satisfied Count Armand's primary concern and allowed him to write to Matthew a letter that was formal but contained, in its final paragraph, something warmer than the situation strictly required. Elspeth read the letter when Matthew showed it to her. She said, "He likes you." Matthew said, "I think he is beginning to." She said, "He would have liked Edouard too in a different way. He respects contained people." Matthew said, "Edouard is very respectable." She said, "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. They talked about Edouard regularly, not with guilt exactly, but with the sustained attention of two people who are aware of what they owe and who they owe it to. They had written to him in Lyon, where he had gone after leaving the estate, a joint letter that had taken them 3 evenings to compose because neither of them had known how to write what they wanted to say without it feeling inadequate, which it did finally, but which they sent anyway because silence was worse. He had written back a single page. Brief and correct and warm in the specific way that Edouard's warmth manifested, not effusive, not demonstrative, but present. He said he was well. He said he was considering the decision he had made, which he continued to believe was the correct one. He said he hoped they were managing the estate's difficulties without too much difficulty. At the very end he wrote, "I am glad it went as it did." Elspeth had read that sentence several times. She had thought about what it cost to write it and mean it, and she was certain he meant it, because Edouard was not a man who said things he did not mean. She had held the letter for a while. Then she had added a paragraph to the joint reply they were composing, in her own voice, that was not about the estate or the legal situation or any of the practical matters. It was a paragraph about the painting of the tree in the wind that Matthew had described in December, and about what she thought it meant, and about certain things being shaped by the pressures acting on them rather than broken by them. She had written, "I believe you are a person who knows this about himself. I wanted to say so plainly in case no one has." She did not know if he received it the way she intended it. She did not know if any of it reached him in the right spirit. What she knew was that Aldrich Pons, who kept his notebook with the same thoroughness regardless of what else was happening in the household, noted that summer that the estate had settled into a new arrangement that he did not recognize from before, but which had a quality of stability he had not been certain they would find. He wrote, "Things are different here now, not bad, not what they were, something else. It takes time to learn the shape of a new thing, I am still learning it." He was not the only one, but they were learning it. Edouard Vachon died in the autumn of 1923, in a small house outside Toulouse that he had owned for 17 years. He was 67 years old. He had not, in the 35 years since he left the Vachon estate on the morning of his brother's wedding, returned to Burgundy. He had lived in Lyon for 3 years after leaving, then traveled for 2, and had eventually settled in the south in the kind of deliberate and considered way that characterized everything he did. He had involved himself in the local administrative life of the region, serving on 2 boards, managing a small piece of property, contributing to a civic project concerned with the preservation of old buildings. He had been, by all accounts, a person of good reputation and reliable character and moderate social presence, a man who was known in his community as someone who could be depended upon, and who kept his own counsel, and who had apparently arrived at something that from the outside looked very much like contentment. Whether it was contentment or something else entirely is a question that only Edouard could have answered, and Edouard, as was consistent with everything that was known about him, did not answer it. He did not marry. He had corresponded intermittently with Matthew over the years, practical letters mostly, concerned with the management of his share of the Vachon inheritance and the occasional matter of family business. The letters were not unfriendly. They were simply Edouard's letters, which meant they were correct and clear and gave nothing away, and which made it possible for both brothers to maintain a connection that was real without requiring either of them to discuss what was real about it. He had never written to Elspeth again after the brief response to their joint letter in the spring of 1888. She had written to him twice over the years, once when Matthew was seriously ill in 1897, a frightening winter that ended better than it had begun, and once when Lady Vachon died in 1905. He had responded to both letters with appropriate brevity and warmth and no more. He had not acknowledged the births of their children, not because he was unkind, but because he was building something in his own life that required a certain kind of distance from the life he had given away, and no one who understood him found this surprising, and no one held it against him. When he died, he left a small estate and a precise will, and a household of modest size that was dispersed efficiently and without complication. The solicitor managing the estate wrote to Matthew to inform him of the death and to indicate that there was a small number of items left to the Vachon family and that these would be sent to the estate in due course. Among those items was a leather correspondence box. It arrived at the estate on a Tuesday in November 1923, wrapped in cloth and packed carefully the way a person packs something that matters. Matthew received it. He was 63 years old and his hair had gone entirely white, and he had spent the morning reading at his desk the way he spent most mornings, a habit of 60 years that had never really changed. He opened the box. Inside was a collection of letters, outgoing and incoming correspondence, neatly sorted, from various periods of Edouard's life. There were business letters and family letters, and the few private letters that Edouard had maintained over the years, all preserved with the same care he brought to everything. At the bottom of the box, separate from the rest, in a sealed envelope that had been placed there deliberately and left unopened, was a letter. It was addressed to Matthew, in Edouard's handwriting. The envelope was old, the paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and the seal had the weight of something that had been sitting in place for a long time. Matthew sat at his desk and held it for a moment. Then he called for Elspeth. She came in and saw the open correspondence box and the envelope in his hands, and she understood what she was looking at without being told. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair she had sat in on her first morning at the estate, over 35 years ago, when she had come down early and found him at the window with his coffee. He opened the envelope. He read the letter to himself first. His face, which had always moved and shown everything, moved through several things in the reading of it, none of which he tried to contain. When he finished, he set it down on the desk. He said he wrote this the night before the wedding. She said he never sent it. He said he never sent it. He pushed the letter across the desk to her. She picked it up and read it. It was 4 pages, written in Edouard's hand, the careful and correct and precise prose she had known from his letters, but different in a way that she recognized immediately. The difference was that in every letter Edouard had ever sent, the containment was complete. Whatever he was working to hold, he held it, and what arrived on the page was the managed result. This letter had not been managed. It had been written, apparently, in one sitting, and the containment was not in place, and what was on the page was Edouard as Edouard was when no one was watching. He wrote about his brother. He wrote about Matthew with an honesty that she had not expected and found difficult to read without stopping. He wrote about what it was like to grow up as the responsible one, the contained one, the one who managed everything and showed nothing, and was reliable in the specific way that useful things are reliable, and what it was like to watch his younger brother move through the world with that open and visible and ungovernable quality that Matthew had always had, which drew things toward him the way certain presences draw things without trying to. He wrote about the years of watching Matthew be the person who could not help being interesting, being alive in a way that was visible, and about his own years of being the person who made it possible for everyone else to do what they needed to do. He was not bitter about it. The letter was many things, but it was not bitter. What it was underneath everything was honest, the kind of honesty that a man produces at 9 o'clock on the night before the most significant act of his life, alone, with no audience and no managed exterior required. He wrote about seeing Elspeth for the first time and knowing, with the clarity he brought to all things, that she was not suited to him. He wrote this without self-pity and without drama and without placing any blame anywhere. It was simply a thing he had seen clearly, the way he saw all things clearly, and had sat with until he knew what to do with it. He wrote that he had seen what was happening over the autumn and winter, and that he had understood it completely, and that he had spent a long time deciding what a correct and honorable and genuinely honest man did when he found himself in possession of something that belonged, more rightly, to someone else. He wrote that he did not experience his decision as a loss. He wrote that he experienced it as the only right action available to him, and that he was a man who had spent his whole life doing the only right action available to him, and that this was the biggest one, and it did not feel as different as he had thought it would. And then, in the final page, he wrote something that Elspeth read twice, and then sat down and looked at the window for a long time before reading again. He wrote about being the elder brother, about what it had meant and what it had cost, and what he had carried alone for 31 years before that particular autumn. He wrote about growing up understanding that certain things were expected of him, and that he had met those expectations without resentment mostly, but that there had been, underneath the competence and the correctness and the managed exterior, a private life, thoughts he had not shared, things he had wanted that were not the things he was supposed to want, a person underneath the useful person that no one had ever quite had the occasion to see. He wrote, "I believe Matthew is the only person in the world who would know what to do with that private person if they saw him. I have come to believe this over many years. I am therefore not certain that what I am giving away tonight is only hers. I think a part of it may be mine as well." He wrote that this was all right. He wrote that some things were best understood late rather than never. He wrote that he was going to leave the estate and find somewhere else to be, and that he hoped his brother would be happy, and that he hoped Elspeth would be happy, and that he trusted both of them to take good care of what he had handed them. At the very end he wrote, If you are reading this, I did not send it. I expect that means I decided it was more honest to say nothing and simply do the thing. That is probably correct, but I wanted it to exist somewhere, even if only in a box. The letter ended there. Elspeth set it down on the desk. She looked at the window. Outside, the November estate was bare and clear and very still. The same rolling fields and the same stone walls and the lavender bed along the south wall, cut back now for winter but there still, as it had been every year for 35 years. She thought about the man who had written those 4 pages, and then placed them in an envelope, and sealed them, and set them at the bottom of a box where they would not be read until he was gone. She thought about all the things Edouard had known and had not said, and had managed and had not shown, and had arranged and had not explained. She thought about the person underneath the useful person. She thought about what it meant to carry something your whole life with great competence and great care, and never once ask anyone for help with it. She thought about being 63 years old, which she was, and sitting across from the man she had been sitting across from in one form or another for 35 years, and the fact that there was still something new to learn, still a door in the story she had not walked through. She said, "He knew you very well." Matthew said very quietly, "I know." She said, "We should have written more." Matthew said he would not have wanted more, he wanted exactly what he had. She thought about that. She was not certain it was entirely true, but she was also not certain it was untrue, and she understood that the only person who could have told them was the person who had arranged it this way deliberately, from his own intelligence and his own knowledge of himself. She picked up the letter again and read the final page one more time. I wanted it to exist somewhere, even if only in a box. She folded the letter carefully. She placed it back in the envelope. She set the envelope on the desk between them. She said, "We should keep this." Matthew said, "Yes." She said, "We should keep it and make sure it is kept after us." He said, "Yes." The November afternoon settled around them. The fire in the grate moved slowly. Outside, the estate was quiet and bare and waiting for the year to turn. Elspeth looked at the envelope on the desk for a long moment. Then she looked at Matthew. She thought about December 1887. She thought about the sentence she had written on a cold afternoon, "They are not merely intellectual, I think you should know that too." She thought about the long patience of a very private person who had understood something more clearly than she had perhaps, and had arranged for it to come to light at the right time, not while there was anything left to regret, but after everything had already been what it was, and was simply now being named. She thought about what it meant to tell the truth sideways, through letters and paintings and trees growing at angles in the wind, and what it meant to tell it directly, from the bottom of a box, in the handwriting of a man who had spent 35 years being exactly what the situation required. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment. Then she opened the leather correspondence box and placed it carefully inside at the bottom, where Edouard had put it. She closed the box. She said, "Shall we have tea?" Matthew looked at her. His face did the thing it had always done, moved, shifted, showed itself. After 35 years she knew every version of it, and she still found it the most readable and honest face she had ever been close to. He said, "Yes, let us have tea." She rang the bell. The fire moved in the grate. Outside, the November light shifted slowly across the old stone walls. The letter remained in the box. It existed. That was what he had wanted. Matthew Vachon died in the spring of 1929, one morning in April, when the lavender was just beginning to come back along the south wall of the estate, and the light had the quality it always had in early spring, clean and slightly tentative, as though it had not yet committed to staying. He died in the library. He had gone there early before breakfast, which was not unusual for him. He had a book on his knee, which was also not unusual. The housemaid who brought his coffee found him in the chair at 7:30, perfectly still, and understood immediately that something had changed in the room, in the particular way that rooms change when the person who has defined them is no longer there. He was 69 years old. Elspeth was 64. She had had in the 41 years of their marriage a great deal of time to think about what she would do when this happened. She was not a person who preferred to be unprepared for things, and she had understood since the illness of 1897, when he had been very sick and she had sat with him through 3 weeks of it, and felt what the possibility of losing him was like, that this was something she would need to survive. She had thought about it carefully, and with the honesty she brought to all serious things, and she had believed, until the April morning when the housemaid appeared at the breakfast table with a face that told her before any words were said, that she knew what it would be like. She did not know. No amount of preparation makes the actual thing the thing you prepared for. That is one of the lessons a long life teaches, and it teaches it again each time, regardless of what you knew before. She spent the first days doing what needed to be done, because things needed to be done, and doing them was both necessary and useful. And she was a practical woman who had always found that the useful thing was also, in difficult moments, the merciful one. The children came, 3 of them, the eldest a man of 38, the youngest a woman of 29, and the house filled for a week with the particular occupied quiet of people managing grief together, and Elspeth moved through it steadily and attended to everything that required attending to. She slept badly. She did not tell anyone this. In the second week, after the children had returned to their own lives and the house had gone quiet again, she went to the library. She did not go to do anything specific. She went because she had been avoiding it, and she was not a person who permitted herself to avoid things for long without acknowledging the avoidance and addressing it. She went in the morning, at the hour he had gone in, and she sat in the chair he had been sitting in, which still had the shape of him in some way she could not have described but could feel. The book he had been reading was still on the side table. She picked it up. It was a text she did not recognize, a philosophical work, recently published, with a paper marker in it approximately a third of the way through. She looked at the open page. She read the paragraph he had last been reading. She could not tell from the paragraph what he had thought about it. She would never know what he had thought about it. She set the book down carefully and looked at the south window and the lavender beginning outside it, and she thought about 41 years. 41 years of the letters arriving and the days happening and the estate moving through its seasons, and the children being born and growing and becoming their own people and the arguments continuing, because they never stopped arguing, not once across 4 decades, about books and ideas and the difference between what was true and what was merely defensible, and the arguments were as alive at 60 as they had been at 22, and this was, she had always known, the specific extraordinary thing about what they had. She thought about the morning she had arrived at the estate as a bride. She thought about the library that first morning, and finding him at the window, and both of them understanding without discussing it that the conversation they had been having for 8 months across paper and ink was now going to happen in a room, in real time, without distance between them. She thought about the night he had told her about Edouard's conversation in the study, and the way she had held that knowledge of what Edouard had sacrificed, had held it with the respect it deserved, and had honored it by understanding that the only right response to a gift of that size was to take it seriously, to build something with it that was worth the cost. She thought about Edouard's letter in the correspondence box. She thought about the private person underneath the useful person, and about things being best understood late rather than never, and about wanting something to exist somewhere even if only in a box. She had written about all of it. That was the thing people did not know, and which she had decided at some point in her late 50s to make known after she was gone. She had kept a private record, not a diary exactly, not the kind of daily account that simply accumulated events, something more considered than that, something she had written in the quiet hours and revised over years, the way a careful thinker revises when she finds she has not yet said quite what she meant. She had written about the contract and the visit and the library that first afternoon. She had written about the letters and what they had been, and what she had understood when she read the sentence about the estate being quiet since she left. She had written about the February visit and sitting in the chair nearest the door rather than the one she usually chose. She had written about December and the decision she had made before she knew she was making it. She had written about the church. She had written about the 12 steps and the understanding coming in pieces, and the moment she stopped walking and looked at his hands and understood they were shaking. She had written about what she had thought in the moment before she took the last steps. Not a summary of it, the way she might have described it to someone else, but the actual interior experience of it, the speed of it, the completeness of it, the way the practical facts and the social facts and the legal facts had all been present and real and genuinely considered, and how at the far side of all of them, what she had found was not a conclusion she had reasoned her way to, but a decision she had already made quietly in the body of a December afternoon, and which the moment at the altar was simply asking her to acknowledge out loud. She had written, in one of the later sections of the record, a sentence that she had revised many times before she was satisfied with it. She wrote, "People have said over the years in various ways that what I did at the altar was brave, which is kind but not quite accurate. I did not feel brave. I felt in that moment that the brave thing and the true thing happened to be the same thing, and that this was not as common as it ought to be, and that when it happens, the right response is to recognize it and not let the opportunity go." She had written about Matthew, about what 41 years of a marriage actually contained, which was not the romantic drama of its beginning, but the long, ordinary, sustained reality of two people who had chosen each other, and kept choosing each other through every difficulty the world offered, which were considerable and various, and not always navigable without damage. She had written about the arguments and the silences, and the children and the grief, and the seasons of the estate, and the lavender coming back every spring along the south wall. She had written about Edouard with the care she believed he was owed. She had written about what it had meant to understand only after his death the full shape of what he had done and what he had carried. She had written about the private person underneath the useful person, and about the particular kind of love that expresses itself as an act of complete renunciation, without expectation of acknowledgement, and about whether that kind of love was the bravest thing or simply the saddest, or whether those were the same thing. She had not arrived at a conclusion on that question. She had left it open, which she believed was honest. She had written one final section in the record, which she had composed and recomposed over several years before she was finally satisfied that it said what she meant. It was about the question she had been asked, occasionally, by various people over the years, by her children, by a journalist who had found out about the story 20 years after the fact and requested an interview she declined, by a neighbor who asked her directly at dinner one evening, with the bluntness of a person who has decided they have known her long enough to ask anything. The question was always a version of the same thing. What was she thinking in the church when she took those last steps? She had answered it differently in different contexts, because different contexts required different levels of honesty, and she had not always been certain that the full truth was what was being asked for. But in the record, she wrote the complete answer. She wrote, "I was not thinking about him, not in the way people imagine when they ask the question. I was not thinking about love, which is a word that covers a great deal and therefore sometimes covers very little. I was not thinking about the contract or the families, or what the mourning would mean socially or legally or practically." She wrote, "I was thinking about the woman I had been in December, sitting at her desk on a cold afternoon with his letter in her hands, and the decision she had made in that moment. Not the decision to write back, not the decision to say what she said, but the deeper decision underneath those, the one she had been making since July in a dozen small ways without acknowledging it, the decision about who she was and what she required and what she was, and was not willing to accept as the shape of her one life." She wrote, "I said yes at the altar, but the yes had happened months before, in an afternoon so quiet I had almost missed it. The altar was simply where I confirmed out loud in front of 200 people something I had already known in private, and the thing I have come to understand in the decades since is that this is how most true things work. They are known quietly in private before they are confirmed publicly. The public moment is real, but the private one is where the actual decision lies." She put down her pen, she read back what she had written, she was satisfied with it, which did not happen often. She closed the record and set it on the desk. It would be found after she died, with a note indicating that it was to be preserved with the estate's family papers. Her eldest son, who managed the estate after her, saw to this without reading it, as she had requested. Her daughter read it eventually, many years later, and understood her mother somewhat differently after reading it, and told her own daughter about it, who told hers. That is how it survived. In the library, on the April morning after Matthew's death, Elspeth sat in his chair for a long time. The lavender was beginning outside the window. The morning light was the tentative clean light of early spring. The book he had not finished sat on the side table with its marker in it. She would finish it, she thought. She would read through to where he had stopped, and then she would keep going, and she would form her own opinion of it, and she would tell him what she thought, which was a habit so old and so deeply built into the structure of her interior life that she did not know how to stop it, and was not going to try. She was going to talk to him about the book. She was going to tell him where the author went wrong in the second section, which she could already see from the marker's position, and she was going to do it the way she had done everything for 41 years, directly and honestly, and with the expectation that he would argue back. The fact that he was not going to argue back was going to take a long time to absorb. She knew this. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She looked at the lavender outside the window. She thought about a letter received one September morning in 1887, carried in on a silver tray by a maid named Cecile. She thought about holding that letter and feeling the weight of it before she opened it, knowing from the handwriting on the envelope who had sent it, and therefore what kind of letter it was likely to be. She thought about opening it anyway. She had opened every letter he ever sent. She had answered every one. She had spent 41 years answering them, first on paper and then in person, in the rooms of the estate and across the library table, and through the long evenings and the difficult seasons and everything the years contained. She looked at the unfinished book on the side table. She picked it up. She began where he had stopped. The lavender moved slightly in the morning air outside the window. The old stone house held the quiet around her, the same quiet it had held for 200 years, indifferent and patient and permanent in all the ways that human lives are not. She read. Outside, spring continued.